Thank you, Bhargavi, and it's an honor to be here, of course, for me as well, and be your speaker within this incredible series in tribute to Michael Owen Jones. I'd also like to say thank you to the dream team here. It's nothing like being hosted by such brilliant and knowledgeable and determined students as these, and it's been a real pleasure to come back here to the University of Virginia, only my second visit here and my first to the A School, because, as Bhargavi says, I'm not an architecture specialist. I'm going to be doing my best to impersonate one for you this evening. So my talk is going to weave in and out of architecture, as well as objects of other scale, and as you'll see, that question of scale and the elasticity of scale in relation to the human is going to be one of my themes. The other theme that I'll be talking about, most importantly, I suppose, would be a kind of double one, which is to do with craft and the future on the one hand, and the future and the past on the other. And it will, I think, make immediate sense to you because craft is a word that's so often associated with the past. So when I was given this kind invitation to be with you tonight, I thought what I would try to do is talk about my most recent two books simultaneously or in relation to one another. So one of those is Craft in American History, and the other is A Century of Tomorrows, which is coming out this upcoming December. So it's drafted but not published yet. And in fact, you guys are the first people seeing the cover, so here it is. I hope you like it. And what it's about really is, as the subtitle said, is how imagining the future over the course of the 20th century had ramifying effects that we still feel today. So what I've done is to try to create a kind of multi-dimensional cultural history of future thinking, which could be trend forecasting, it could be architecture and design, it could be philosophy and theory, it could even be the insurance industry, which I won't trouble you with tonight, but if you think about it, insurance is one of the most powerful ways that we organize our thinking and resourcing around the future. So the control, management, and allocation of risk, the projection of capital from the present into ever greater time horizons, and overall the idea of prototyping what might come through a present day act of creativity, of building, of visualization, or textual assertion. That's what the book is about. So what I'm going to be doing is giving you just a few of the stories from this book as pertains most closely to architecture, and also in a way that hopefully suggests some non-oppositional relationship, maybe a dialectical relationship between craft and futurology, thinking about the future. So that's what we're going to do tonight. I hope it makes sense. I'll just start by reminding you that architecture and what I'm calling futurology, so the study or thinking about the future, has a long, long history, obviously much further back than the 20th century. And in some ways, in fact, architecture has been the discipline that carries future thinking. And I will get back to this in a second, but when I say architecture, I really mean everything from a piece of furniture all the way up to the landscape or indeed the planetary scale. And I will return to that, but I'm using architecture here in a very scale-inclusive way. So ideal city representations of the Renaissance, this famous image that many of you will know by Etienne Boulle, which is a cenotaph for Isaac Newton, so an imaginary burial site for Isaac Newton. I'll just pause here to say that often when we see futurologists practicing as architects or vice versa, what we will see is that they represent that future and the buildings of the future in very abstract terms, and often in ways that could not be built in the present day. And that leap into abstraction, which perhaps we're only now catching up to because of technology, is very characteristic in future architecture. And it's one of the reasons, perhaps, that we think of future thinking and future architecture as being so oppositional to craft. It's not just that craft is a way of reinscribing tradition and emphasizing the value of what's been passed down from previous generations, that hand-to-hand idea that's so familiar when we think about craft. It's also because futurology reliably denies the reality of our physical environment, and because craft is, if nothing else, a way of completely acknowledging and reasserting the potentiality of the physical environment. That is a natural point of division within the story, and this would be another great example of that, this postcard from the 1890s showing Copley Square in Boston, my hometown. in the future. And again, you'll see that the proposal here is for lots of unbuildable things or then unbuildable things. So that idea of the future as something that's impossible to realize in the present, and that almost being the defining feature of futurist architecture or futurological architecture, is something that runs across centuries. We also, in the 20th century, of course, see it especially in science fiction film. And again, you'll see the habitual abstraction in images like this. This is a set designed for Shapes of Things to Come from 1936, based on the H.G. Wells novel. You see it in Metropolis, of course, maybe the most famous early 20th century science fiction film with its narrative of heaven and hell, kind of upstairs, downstairs, itself very closely based on H.G. Wells' book Time Machine. If you've read that, you know this idea of a kind of perfect realm, utopia above the ground and a dystopia below the ground. Now, what's interesting is that at the same time that these science fiction narratives were being developed, you had a contrary, what you might call ultra-pragmatist school of architectural thinking that I would imagine is still something you're all discussing, at least in the landscape architecture part of UVA, which is the Garden Cities movement, which is originated by Ebenezer Howard, the British urbanist, very much a frustrated man in his own time. So, you know, he had this idea of a garden city, meaning not necessarily a heaving metropolis, but rather a small, almost village-scale settlement that would be built around a park at its heart, hence the name. And this idea became extremely influential, but not necessarily during his own lifetime. So just a couple of these places were built. They still exist today in England. But he's, again, during his own time, very much a future thinker, sort of laying down a pathway by which architecture and urbanism could be rethought, and very much a critical thinker, but not operating through principles of abstraction, but rather operating through a principle of return to a kind of essential unity with the land. And again, just rehearsing some of the well-known milestones along this historical trajectory. We also, of course, have Frank Lloyd Wright, who in his book Disappearing Cities, which many of you will know, really launched an astonishing, harsh criticism of the modern urban landscape. As you can see here on this image on the left, find the citizen. Where is that person? They've been totally obscured by not only the weight of architecture, but also the weight of pollution, the noise, the activity level, the kind of vortex of the city. And then on the right, you have, of course, beyond the vortex, the rural landscape where people are at the right scale, you might say, with their surroundings. And this is what lay behind, of course, his famous broad acre city plan, which is sort of garden city thinking combined with egomania would be a good way of defining it. So the idea here is that Frank Lloyd Wright would not be just designing your house, but would be designing the entire American landscape through this repeated, flexible system that would extend across the entirety of the country. Characteristic Frank Lloyd Wright there. So this beautiful model, which I actually had the pleasure to see at Taliesin, his workshop in Wisconsin, although it's also been shown at the Museum of Modern Art. Beautiful handmade model, a point I'll get back to in a second. So you have this opposition then between, broadly speaking, what you might call an abstract, explicitly futurological landscape and architecture set of propositions, and then on the other hand, again, seemingly diametrically opposed to it, an idea of the landscape as right-sized, as modest, as materially, not just realizable, but materially eloquent, really trying to come to grips with local resources and be embedded deeply in the culture of the here and now. So the impossible but visionary versus the eminently possible and the crafted. That's a very natural opposition for us, and in rehearsing it here, I'm just pointing out to something you all know very well. And it's interesting to me that that dialectic, I think, still is one that structures our thinking today. So often we will think about a kind of localism, whether we're talking about politics or we're talking about food or talking about architecture, as opposed to globalism, so a kind of giganticness of scale, which these days we might think of in terms of data, technology of information exchange, but again, abstract processes. So it's it's basically the farmer's market versus Google. And in some ways that opposition, which I think we all subscribe to, consciously or not, is simply reprising a conflict in thinking that goes all the way back to the early 20th century. Worth mentioning that this also is a discourse that sweeps up a lot of cultural difference within its wake and tends to diminish the reality of those differences. So I'll get back to this towards the end of the lecture, but these are two images of the same adobe structure from the Southwest, a mission church that's out of Taos. On the left, you're seeing a painting by George O'Keeffe, and on the right, a photograph by Ansel Adams. And this obviously is not explicitly futurological architecture, but in a way, it's offered to the viewer as a kind of template for what architecture ought to be. So there's a kind of strong ethical charge. And although this is, as I said, Spanish mission architecture, so built by who knows which artisans, in fact, in the 18th or 19th century, the building is clearly in dialogue with the indigenous structures of nearby Taos, and the conversation, including in Adams' photographs and O'Keeffe's paintings generally, is about a kind of authenticity or reality, and also a kind of humanism that's instilled in these buildings that no modern, quote, Western white settler kind of building could possibly achieve. And so that's also there in the frame, possibly destabilizing that opposition in some ways. And again, I'll get back to that. And again, lots of ways of thinking about this. We might think about, for example, the Serpent Mound in Ohio as a kind of emblem of architectural practice in the 20th century, particularly for surrealist architects, Friedrich Kiesler, that kind of figure, and a sense that the possibilities of the future might be actually located in the deep past, and we might simply need to rediscover or reinvent the possibilities of architecture, and that would be the script. So, as I say, it sort of destabilizes the opposition that I'm drawing, because of course this is an abstract form and it's a transcendental form, and yet it's also a form that's very much about deep past, about cultural authenticity. So there are different ways of navigating these debates, but essentially the debates stay in their safe corners. Craft on one side, future on the other, the past on one side, the future on the other, and this is how we organize ourselves. Now, what I'm going to try to suggest to you this evening is that there's a totally different way of thinking about this, which is that craft is actually the mode of operation by which the future is generated, and that the best way of thinking about craft actually is not as a repository of the past, but actually as a method of adaptation and response to circumstance and creativity. And here the great example, of course, would be the prototype, which I'll get back to in a second, but it's not the only, because that's the first thing that leaps to mind for you, of course, right? You're going to make something, even if you're going to make 1 million of them, you first have to make one, and probably by hand, almost certainly by hand. But there's lots of other ways of thinking about that too. And just for fun, this is a still from the film The Day the Earth Stood Still. And believe it or not, this is, by the way, one of the first on-screen appearances of a flying saucer. And does anybody know who designed the interior of the flying saucer? Frank Lloyd Wright. Fun fact. But the reason I bring that up is because this is, of course, a future, very aggressively futuristic environment, but it's also handmade, right? It's a film set. And when you think about it, everything I've shown you so far pretty much is handmade. The drawings and paintings I began with, the Broadacre City model, Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City model, certainly the Adobe Church. So actually the craftedness of the future weirdly turns out to be a nearly pervasive phenomenon. And again, on one level that's obvious, because if you're going to postulate something about the future, by definition it hasn't been realized, and it certainly hasn't been realized in the context of mass production. But that obvious point breaks down a lot of our customary thinking about what craft is, and in particular our association, our very ready association between craft and traditionalism, craft in the past, and also perhaps a certain set of assumptions about craft and what I might call inefficiency, in other words, a lack of fitness to purpose, to modern life, to modernity itself. Because if there's anything that we can say about craft, it's that it's figured from the very beginning, in fact defined as I argued in another book, which is called The Invention of Craft, is defined by its opposition to industry. And it, in some ways, comes into existence as the other to industry. So everything that goes with that set of ideas has to do with craft being rooted, perhaps valuably so, rooted in a previous way of doing things that's becoming outmoded and obsolete. And when we hold on to it, we're trying to hold on to some vestige of that former version of ourselves as humans. But what if we thought of the Trilon and the perisphere of the World's Fair as craft objects, which, of course, they were, just like the Empire State Building, handmade by specialist artisans, right? Despite their abstraction. And, of course, the perisphere is Boole's cenotaph for Newton, reborn, right? Just for a grand audience and actually realized in full scale. But it's also a handmade object, as was every other statement about the future that came out of the 1939 World's Fair, which again I'm using as an obvious milestone moment. It was called the World of Tomorrow, that World's Fair, and everything that populated it was a suggestion of the excitement that was to come. And yet at the same time, by virtue of the fact that they were all prototypical, they were handmade things. So here's a famous robot based on RUR, which is the play that brought us the word robot from the Czech. You may know that the original meaning of the word is slave or servant in Czech, and so that was imported by virtue of this theatrical production originally to London. So that's Eric the robot on the left, going to be put on stage, and then that's a smoking robot called Electro that was put on view at the 1939 World's Fair. But of course, the most famous thing that happened at the fair, the thing we all go back to again and again, and you can't talk about the Futuramas in the 20th century without dealing with it in some straight-on way, is Norman Balgetti's Futurama. So just brief overview if you haven't engaged with the kind of absurdity of Norman Balgetti's before. He was one of the first generation of industrial designers alongside people like Raymond Murray and Henry Dreyfuss. And he was particularly well known for his writing and his pontificating and sort of symbolic activity rather than things he actually got built. So where some of the other designers were very successful in working with clients, Balgetti's was basically a showman and a kind of theatrical impresario. So the thing that people will go back to, apart from the Futurama, is his book Horizons, published in 1932, which is kind of the quintessential statement of breathless, future-facing, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead thinking that he's offering to depression-stunned America as a way of trying to almost shake the country out of its doldrums. And as you can say, he says, speed is the cry of our era. We have to get faster, 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 as if that were some kind of ethical solution, right? And again, something that we still talk about and think about today. One way of thinking about the whole 20th century is a history of acceleration, right? So, whether it's vehicles or construction or information exchange, it's basically the era in which things get faster. That might be the single most important dynamic, you could argue, maybe speed and complexity, which of course are interrelated variables. But anyway, Balgetti stands at the very beginning of the full-throated embrace of speed as a virtue in its own right, and he expresses that in his, again, unrealized prototypical vehicle designs, and then he brings it to its full fruition in the Futurama, which is funded by General Motors, so of course a car company, and is by far the most successful, well-attended event at the fair. As you can see, another hand-built, streamlined, abstract building, conveying the audience into its guts as if it were an assembly line in Detroit, and then actually depositing them, as if to literalize that metaphor, on this elevated, moving, the sort of monorail with seats. And what it would do is bring people around this diorama that Balgetti has conceived and designed and had built, that was a representation of America in 1960. So it's 21 years in the future. And the idea here is that it's as if you were in a plane looking down on this landscape of the future, and you would have this voice intoning the qualities of that landscape as you traveled through it. This is, of course, pre-Disney World. So if you've been to Disney World and are wondering where the whole idea of like Pirates of the Caribbean came from, it's really, this is the launching point for that whole social technology. But again, the Futurama landscape is entirely hand-built. And in fact, what's interesting is that, like the Empire State Building, in fact, there was a lot of interest in the artisanal labor that went into the Futurama. So a lot of the news reports about this actually emphasized its handmadeness and the thousands and thousands of hours that went into creating this basically model train set scale version of what the future would look like. And I was able to find this really amazing image of two of the workmen striding like, Godzilla and King Kong across this landscape. And it just really emphasizes the degree to which the wonder of this experience was partly its futurity and Balgetti's claims about what America would be like, including his very GM-friendly message that it was going to be connected by major highway systems, which of course didn't exist in 1939 and did in fact exist in 1960. He was absolutely right about that. But you could argue that the real interest that people had in this experience was in fact the craft quotient. It was the fineness and precision and unending detail of this experience that people really lined up for. It wasn't the ideas, right? So that's a really interesting thing, that it's not just craft's functional role in bringing the future about or visualizing it or making it available to the mind. It's also the demonstrative and quite human, sort of boundary pushing human capability to bring that future to you in the present that craft delivers in a situation like this. That's what provides the marvel. That's what provides the wonder. It is the craftedness that is the vehicle for the amazement of the future experience. And again, that's true right down to the present day. It's still true in Hollywood movies, just as it was in Shapes of Things to Come. So really interesting kind of backwards way of thinking about craft as this kind of delivery system for the future, and maybe vice versa as well. Now, what happens if we take a step back again into the onwards trajectory of the division or the opposition that I began the lecture with, this abstract futurity on the one hand and this local craftedness on the other? What you also will see is that starts to become more and more real and more contested and conflicted in the actual American landscape. And again, not telling you anything you don't know, especially if you're in the landscape architecture school, but for example, you have this kind of middle ground ideal that propagates itself across America in the 1930s and 1940s that we ultimately come to call suburbia, another thing that Balgetti's predicted with uncanny accuracy in the Futurama, which begins with things like the electrification of rural homes and ultimately culminates just before the war, as you can see here in 1939, with the construction of what were called garden cities on the Ebenezer Howard model all across America, and that becomes ultimately probably the communities that many of you grew up in. I certainly did. I grew up on a street where every house was exactly the same. They were just painted different colors and turned in different directions, right? And that was architectural variety where I came from. And that's all an idea that comes out of this moment. So it's this idea of having it both ways, having the kind of efficiency and abstraction and systems logic of familiar future thinking and that attachment to architecture, and also this kind of localism and groundedness that we might associate with someone like Howard. Again, having a rural farm, but also having electricity. So starting to break down that opposition. No figure is more central in that attempt to demolish the opposition between the abstract and the real, if you like, if I could really strip it down to its most essential form, than Buckminster Fuller, another hard to avoid figure in the story, probably the 20th century's most recognizable futurist. Known for lots of things, especially for talking. He's the sort of person that would, if you invited him here to be the Michael Owen Jones Lecture, you would have to make a decision at about 8 o'clock in the morning tomorrow as to whether to go to get a cup of coffee, and he would barely have paused for breath. My favorite thing about Buckminster Fuller is that he did a lecture towards the end of his life called Everything I Know. And he talked for 40 hours with breaks, and you can actually see it all on the Buckminster Fuller Institute website with a full transcript, and it just goes on and on and on and on, and it's all kind of interesting is the real bitch of it. So, you know, he's a very, very compelling, polymathic, again, quite absurdist, very similar to Balgetti's in that way, figure lodged right in the center of 20th century futurology. You know, like one of those, I always think he's like one of those signs that you'll see at a crossroads with arrows going every which direction, like Cairo is this distance away, Singapore is that distance. He's like a human version of that. Anyway, the most important of his early ideas, if you could call it a single idea, or it's really a piece of terminology, is Dymaxion, which stands for dynamic maximum tension, and is both a structural idea and also a brand that he brought to buildings. So here's the first Dymaxion house, another handcrafted thing that was meant to be put into mass production, and he tried his damnedest to achieve that, especially during the war. He somewhat unpersuasively claimed that these would be perfect military structures to be built across the Pacific Theater, especially. And yet, at the same time, he absolutely despised the architectural profession of his time. The feeling was mutual, too, by the way. And this is maybe my favorite quote of his description of architects. So that's one to write down for yourselves and put on your wall up in the A school. So sometimes jolly, sometimes sanctimonious, occasionally she, and often pathetic organization of shelter tailors. So that's y'all. And, you know, at the same time, he was, of course, thinking, as I alluded to earlier, at many different scales at once, including the global. He famously called our world spaceship Earth, and he also had this mapping technology that sustained that idea. So the concept here is that the Earth is like a spaceship traveling through the inky darkness, this hellish abyss, that's not life-sustaining and has a certain amount of resources, and we're all crew members on the spaceship, and we need to start thinking of ourselves as being therefore not just on one team instead of aligned against one another because of nation state boundaries, but we also need to think of ourselves as being maximally efficient, again, Dymaxion principles, because otherwise we're going to run out of resources and we're going to be stuck in the middle of literally nowhere, floating through the cosmos without enough things to sustain us. Very powerful idea, particularly in its day when people, you know, Earth Day is still like 30 years off at this point, right? So one of the first things he did to get this idea across, even before he coined the term spaceship Earth, was to create what he ultimately called the Dymaxion map, which was a way of looking at the world where you realize that all of the land masses are actually relatively contiguous. So if you think about a Mercator projection, which is the standard one you'd have on your wall of like a grade school classroom, the continents look like they're really far apart. And in fact, of course, they are. But if you look at it from the North Pole down, you can see that they all are like, you know, flowers on a daisy chain. And ultimately, he formalized that into what he called the Dymaxion map, which you see here on the right. And again, a really great example of the abstract future systems-based thinking that goes back through Boole, you know, and the cenotaph, being applied, so geometric thinking being applied to a kind of real-worldism ideological statement. And then obviously the most important contribution that he made to architecture in any technical sense was the geodesic dome. So this is him playing with geodesic and related tensegrity structures at Black Mountain College on the left-hand side. And that's a group of his students trying to make a geodesic dome using Venetian blinds. And this obviously didn't work. And as you can see, and they in fact called it the supine dome because it just lay there frustratingly on the ground. But the geodesic dome became real. You saw the cartoon of him as a geodesic dome from the cover of Time magazine a second ago, and this became, you know, absolutely welded to his persona and the ultimate symbol of his thinking. Now, I have a story to relate about all this that I think brings it all together in a really, really interesting way. And it's, I think, also very telling that it involves going to another part of the world. So this is a little bit of an interlude in the lecture, and it has to do with the country of Ghana. Now, this is a very long story, which I tried to tell at sort of medium length in my book, and I'm going to tell in super short version with you. It's not a very well-known story, and it's not something you can go and read about that easily. but it is absolutely fascinating. So it involves Fuller, and then this other character who's called Constantine Doxiadis, who I was actually asking the guys up here, is he somebody you guys talk about in the landscape architecture school at all? Not really? Okay. Very interesting, I guess kind of esoteric, but a very formative thinker for utopian urbanism in the 1960s. And he invented this concept that he called icistics, which has to do with his attempt to replace the concept of utopia, which, as you probably know, literally means no place in Greek, with what he called entopia, E-N-topia, which means sort of a utopia of real places, right? So this is his big project, and he had a lot of funding. Based in Athens, he had a lot of funding from the Ford Foundation, among other institutes, and he would gather people together, including Fuller, on a yacht in the Aegean every summer. So Marshall McLuhan would come, Barbara Ward, the great economist, would come, and they would talk about the future of cities. And then they published this journal, which is called Icistics, which you can actually read online. Fascinating. As you can see, one of the early issues had Fuller's Dymaxion map on its cover. He was a major kind of influence and inspiration for them. And then you can also see that, at least I hope you can see, that they had this idea that icistics was the art of thinking at all scales simultaneously, from the room, house, plot, block, neighborhood, community, small town, average town, large city, metropolis, large metropolis, megalopolis, large region, and then ecumenopolis, by which Doxiadis meant the entire world, right? And you can see that they're trying to think about all those. I mean, this is the simplest of the icistics charts, but it's a very telling one, because what he's trying to show you is that there are these kind of waves and flows of thinking and knowledge and information that you would need to correlate that traverse all of these scales. So, I mean, this isn't a very exciting image on the left, but in a way, if you were to try to map a style of thinking that's maybe characteristic to the UVA architecture school, this would be a really good place to start, because what you're trying to do is locate all of these different scales in one data visualization. Whether you accept his specific proposals or not, for example, that cultural and aesthetic aspects max out at the small scale and decline at the large scale, which is maybe not something we would think in the age of the internet. In fact, we might even do it the other way around these days. But whether you agree with his propositions, this style of thinking is anyway, I think, quite relevant. As an outsider, to me, it seems quite relevant to what you guys are doing. So, as I said, Ghana, what happens is that, as you may know, Ghana is the first African country to throw off its colonial overlord, right? So they become an independent country in 1957, and Kwame Nkrumah, who is a revolutionary politician who had actually been educated in the United States, becomes the president. And he's only president for a very short time. I think it's 57 to 64 when he's deposed in a military coup. But in that 7 years, he attempts to execute what we might think of as a kind of modernist, utopian, also socialist-leaning plan for the country. And spoiler alert, the reason that he's deposed is because he's too socialist for the Americans, and the CIA arranges for him to be deposed when he's away on a trip, and he's never able to return to Ghana after that. So who does he bring in to help him build the new Ghana? Doxiadis, and Fuller in a much smaller capacity. So here's a real building that was constructed to Doxiadis's plans by some of his acolytes, as one architectural historian has put it, almost reproducing the sort of low build style and scale of a suburban new town in England in Ghana. And at the same time, Fuller comes on a couple of visits and builds these specimen geodesic domes, which again are handcrafted. And these images were shared with me by a guy called Thomas Turman, who was actually in the group of students that Fuller brought to Ghana in 1957, I think it was, for the first time, and then back in 1963 to build this dome. So this is the cap of the dome, which, as you can see, they're building out of aluminum. And these are just some of the construction images of it, which is kind of amazing to see. And and then it is finished for the International Trade Fair, which is one of Nkrumah's kind of big, almost Soviet-style sort of flag-waving moments of national realization. Now, at the same time that this was happening, and it's no accident that this is an aluminum dome, because Nkrumah is also involved in the construction of a dam on the Volta River, which has its own aluminum dome, right, and is for processing bauxite and raw metal to create material that can be exported to prop up Ghana's extremely fragile post-war economy, which is really dependent on a single export crop of cocoa, along with some diamonds and gold that they were able to mine. And so the creation of this dam and this factory that resulted from it, believe it or not, it was incredible to me when I read about this, because like, how do I not know this? But this dam created the largest artificial lake in the world, covering 3% of the entire country's land mass and displacing 80,000 people who used to live in that place, right? So massive transformation, and you might say characteristic modernist imposition of systems thinking and resource extraction on this population. And Doxiadis and Fuller, as these modernist utopian thinkers, are right at the heart of that. Very, very interesting. And I guess to me, that suggests this other way of thinking about the downstream results of this kind of abstraction. So yes, it starts with craft, but then the question is what happens to it next, right? So you have futurology as a creative, generative, positive force, and then you also have futurology as this corrosive, destructive force. And the really interesting thing, or compelling, challenging thing about the Volta Dam is that it's both at the same time. It is destroying the country to create the country, is depopulating or, displacing local population in order to provide electricity and welfare to the rest of the population. So there are trade-offs, and I'm very struck by, it's an argument that I kind of borrowed from a sociologist called Ulrich Beck. We were talking about this earlier, about this book called Risk Society, where he says that the functions of late capitalism, generally speaking, are more and more located out in the future at further and further timescales, and they have more and more to do with the reallocation of risk rather than the reallocation of capital. In other words, capital goes along fine doing its business, being expansionist, but in a world of limited resources and inherent conflict, what companies and nation states need to do ultimately is to shift their own risks onto other people. And the movement of that risk is what defines late capitalism as opposed to early stage capitalism. Very interesting argument, and one that, as you can appreciate, is extremely relevant to that Ghanaian story. So let's go back to the 1939 World's Fair and tell this narrative one more time. So here we are with the trial on the Perisphere. The other thing that was happening at that fair, which again is not as well known a story, certainly not as much as the Futurama, was the creation of a time capsule, which was made of an aluminum alloy, as it happens, by the Westinghouse company, major electric company of that time. So this kind of rocket-like object makes me think of the diagram some of you may know that Alfred Barr did for the Museum of Modern Art, showing what its collection would be like. It's like a rocket going through the future, and they're going to de-accession everything after 25 years because it's entirely future-oriented organization. Obviously, the first time that their Cezanne turned out to be 25 years old, they got over that idea very quickly. But this idea of a sort of relentless, frictionless missile shot into the future, and that's what this time capsule was going to be. It was meant to be opened after 5,000 years, right? So 6939 it was going to be opened, and so it was made of this ultra rust resistant alloy, and it was filled with all of this stuff. So real objects, first of all, especially American style objects like a baseball, that kind of thing. There were lots of branded items in there, interestingly, as well. And then, a touch that feels simultaneously genius and rather poignant to me, they really leaned a lot on microfilm as a way of getting information across, because they thought, right, we should have the entirety of the world's literature, at least as much as we can gather and stuff into this thing. So they had the Bible translated into every language. I mean, if that's not a 1930s American idea, what is, right? The Christian text in everybody else's language. And they even included, hilariously, a set of plans to build a microfilm viewer on the theory that microfilm might not be around in 6939 anymore. So they really thought it through in some ways. This is some of the contents of the time capsules. You can see there's the U.S. flag, of course, right front and center, and as I say, all sorts of other things, including branded objects, and that's them assembling the time capsule there on the left. They also canvassed the world's great and good, or at least America's great and good, for statements to this future world. And they did say, we realized that maybe in that future people won't know the language anymore, but they included a dictionary, so they thought, hey, maybe they can figure it out. And so they included this statement from Albert Einstein, which I'll just read. The production and distribution of commodities is entirely unorganized. He's describing the present day of 1939, which, keep in mind, just on the verge of World War, right? Entirely unorganized, so that everybody must live in fear of being eliminated from the economic cycle, in this way suffering for the want of everything. Furthermore, people living in different countries kill each other at irregular time intervals. I trust that posterity will read these statements with a feeling of proud and justified superiority. So here we are posterity, and it's interesting to think about whether we do read these words with a proud and justified superiority. Probably not. I also think that when Westinghouse asked Einstein for a statement, this is probably not what they were hoping they would get, but they did put it in the time capsule and they allowed it to be reprinted. Again, a very 1939 thing. It was the time of the public intellectual, you could say, which arguably is past. And, when I read this, I thought, okay, you have this handmade missile, right? And then what happens during the war? This is Little Boy, which is dropped on Hiroshima, and this is Fat Man, which is dropped on Nagasaki. And the conceptual DNA of the time capsule and the atom bombs, to me, it makes them an irresistible comparison, and we don't really have time to talk about that. It's kind of a shocking idea to me, and one that would easily occupy a 3-hour seminar and more to really work through the implications of that. But, here you have a completely hand-built object made by extremely talented technicians, call them artisans or not. They're people who really know how to use their hands, have incredible material intelligence, vast technical expertise. And then the result of all that, obviously, is this, right? So how do we acknowledge the reality that craft is playing a part in that kind of destruction? And then also think about the claims that were made about the atom bomb at the time it was dropped on Japan, about it saving lives, right? Because if they hadn't done this, the argument was they would have had to have a land invasion instead, which would have been much more destructive and cost not just American but Japanese lives. So there was, bizarrely, in retrospect, although perhaps these points could still be debated justifiably, there was an argument that this was a kind of humanitarian thing to drop these bombs on a non-compliant opponent. And so, weirdly, the bombing of these two great Japanese cities also feels kind of like the building of the Volta Dam. We destroyed we destroyed the country in order to save it. An infamous phrase that would come up later as we go through the history of post-war America, the panic around atomic warfare. This is a wonderful book. Robert Junk's Tomorrow is Already Here. Again, not very well known. Originally published in German, Die Zukunft ist schon gekommen. And this is him talking about the site of the Trinity test, as he says, the navel or the birthmark of the new era. So this is the world that we're born into post-war. And ultimately, it propagates the world of the Rand Corporation, the great Futurological Institute in California, that becomes the think tank for the Vietnam War. Jung also sees them, this is back in 1952, he sees them conducting these war games. This is his passage about that. These mechanical, very much evocative of today's artificial intelligence, actually. It was sort of the artificial intelligence of the day, you could say. So creating these machines that calculate the possible or likely outcome of various conflicts, and then determining what they think will happen if you change certain variables like the number of armaments or the population size or the timing of a certain attack. So all of this, a very different kind of non-craft-based prototyping, you could say. And as you can see, Jung's last words here are, the oracle has spoken. And then all of this, of course, becomes horrifically real during the Vietnam War era. So here's Junk's in a later publication showing a real futurological institute, the future of political institutions. And on the right, does anyone recognize that? It's Dr. Strangelove, yeah. So, Kubrick's mockery of this, and then ultimately, as I say, the actual Vietnam War happens, where, in fact, that idea we destroyed the village in order to save it becomes all too real, and America finds itself as the protagonist of arguably a genocidal assault against another country for reasons that become quite unclear to everybody involved quite swiftly, but is unable to pull itself out of the morass. And, again, without getting into the political trajectory of post-war America, you could say that this is the nadir and ultimately the total evisceration of futurological thinking. So the confidence that had been instilled in this profession of futurology, as Jung was looking at it in the 1950s, for example, or as was exemplified by someone like Balgetti's and Fuller in the 1930s, that becomes completely disenfranchised, and its credibility becomes extremely compromised because of the nature of the Vietnam War. And in fact, Robert McNamara, as you may know, really began as a kind of futurologist himself, working for Ford, so GM's competitor in Detroit. So his constant insistence that the Vietnam War could be predicted, could be measured, could be rationalized, and therefore be won through data analysis, obviously turned out to be horrifically wrong. And that became a turning point not only in the history of the country, and of course in the history of Vietnam, but also a turning point in the history of futurology itself. So just bring to the end of the first part of the lecture, the reaction to this, of course, is in many ways to reinvest in craft and the local, and to disabuse ourselves collectively of the idea that rationalist systems thinking, institutions, nation-state governments, corporations especially, and certainly places like the Rand Corporation who become demonized, should be in charge, and instead to look for other forms of authority and truth, some of which are found inside one's own head. So that's psychedelia in the late 1960s, this wonderful publication Oracle from San Francisco being a great example of that. A return to the thinking that was fashionable briefly in the 1930s around indigenous cultures, so the idea that a truth would be found in the deep past, and that the opposition between the future and the past is itself part of the problem, and that turning to cultures like Native Americans who don't make those kinds of ready oppositions between future viability and past viability would be a very good idea. And then ultimately that what we need to do is to widely distribute possibility itself, which is what the Whole Earth Catalog maybe stands for. It's very well known. This is something, if you haven't run into, it would probably be something you would want to look into, especially if you're in the landscape architecture school. So this was kind of like the hippie Sears catalog, run by someone called Stuart Brand. And the idea was to put, as you can see, access to tools. The idea was to put the tools and capabilities of self-reliance into everybody's hands. And it's a wonderful, wonderful catalog. I'll just point out one fun detail, which is that in those days of mimeographing and publishing in a very low-key way, he tried to find very efficient ways to get information across. And one thing he did was to photograph all the objects next to the same ball so you could understand the scale. So it's kind of this indexical trace of size, which I think is also very interesting and telling in relation to that acoustics thing of all scales being relevant simultaneously. It's like this is a master key. So whether you're trying to cook a meal or create an entire civilization, the Whole Earth Catalog is here for you, that kind of idea. And of course, what came out of this thinking was computers. And in fact, Stuart Brand has often talked about a kind of a futurologist who had strong premonitions of the world to come in terms of digital technology. He actually was involved in, this is another long story I don't have time to tell you, but he was involved in what's been called the mother of all demonstrations, which was run by somebody called Doug Engelbart, who was a very early Silicon Valley engineer, and Stuart Brand was actually the cameraman for the demonstration, and it was the first time that a mouse had been demonstrated, including, and also was the first demonstration that had a hypertext and lots of other things that we now take for granted. This is in the late 60s. And then that same set of ideas and that same culture, of course, produced you know who, right? And, you know, maybe if I was going to have one slide to sort of summarize everything I'm trying to say to you, this would be it. So the handmade wooden cabinet for the first Apple computer by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. This is like mid-1970s now, and this is absolutely coming out of that same culture as the Whole Earth catalog. And in fact, the early ideology of Apple is very much organized around those lines of access to tools. The reason they want to make the computer is actually because they want to wrest power, ironically, from centralized corporations, right? It's to put power in the hands of the people. That's at least the rhetoric of Apple and all these other Silicon Valley revolutionaries in the early years. And obviously it's now very easy to sneer at that, talk about the superiority of posterity, to paraphrase Einstein. But on the other hand, I wrote and put together this talk on an Apple computer. So who am I to say, right? And probably all of you, if not almost all of you, have at least one Apple product in your lives that you're depending on. And maybe even some of you are tempted to check your text right now on it, right? Because you've spent 35 minutes. So we have to acknowledge the reality of these things in our lives, and in a way that extreme dichotomy between craft and the future and the past that I spoke about with reference to the Volta Dam and to the atom bombs is also present in a smaller, more manageable, but possibly even more dramatically influential and explosive form in these devices that we carry around with us. And they stem from the same set of debates, the same set of conflicts. Okay, so that's the main part of the talk. I do actually have an epilogue, though, which I'm going to do quickly for you. So this is the other way of thinking about it, future craft. And here I'm going to leave architecture behind, really, and talk about objects. And this is me going back to my last book, Craft in American History, and thinking about how this book looks in the rearview mirror for me now that I've written a book about the future. So again, even for me as I conceive these books, they seem kind of like siblings or like mirror images of one another. So one book about something that feels traditional that turns out to be very generative, the other book being about something that feels very progressive and turns out often to be conservative and kind of scary, both of them rotating around this ever fleeting present. And so in some way, they both seem like they're books about the now and the experience of the now, as it would be expressed either through an act of crafting or an act of prediction, which, as I say, turns out to often be the same thing. So that's this book. On the cover is this quilt by a woman called Jessie Telfair. This was made in 1983, but it's her way of materializing her memories of the civil rights movement, in which she was a key participant. And what she did was to kind of retrofit this, she got the letter forms from this early 20th century guide on how to quilt. So again, a very kind of normative, conservative source that she's using as a design guide. And she makes this quilt that basically is the textile equivalent of a march, right? Freedom, freedom, freedom now. What do we want? Freedom. When do we want it now? It's that as a quilt. And I thought, just to go back to this for a second, I thought putting her with Paul Revere on the cover just seemed like such an interesting move, right? Like northern white dude, silversmith, southern black woman, textile worker, but both revolutionaries, right, in different centuries. So that's why the cover looks like it does. But following that line of thinking, it occurred to me that there's something about quilting, which the most famous example would be Gee's Bend, again, was like your textbook example, this famous small town in Alabama, which has these kind of miracle worker artists working as quilts. Quilt makers, maybe the most revered of them all, Mary Lee Bendolph, taking the scraps that are available to them, including the work clothes that are no longer usable even for field work, agricultural field work, and transmuting them into these abstract painting-like forms. In fact, quick story, when I was at the Milwaukee Art Museum, this was like in 2003 or 4, we actually had a show about we had the Quilts of Gee's Bend show visit to Milwaukee from Houston,
And we actually had a group of the quilters come up from Gee's Bend on a bus, and it was amazing. They sang gospel songs in the atrium, and we gave them a tour of the building. And what people had been saying about Gee's Bend, including the New York Times, what people had been saying about Gee's Bend quilts is that they looked weirdly like abstract paintings. It was like this kind of magical thing from the black soil of Alabama, they would say in print, right? And we're walking through the museum wondering what they're going to make of this place. And I remember one of them turned and looked at this demon coin and said, that would make a great quilt. And we were all like, oh, this is two-way traffic, right? The idea that the painting is the object of ambition, like the thing to aspire to, and the quilt is the thing that can be venerated by bringing it up to that level, could be entirely backwards if you think about this as a design for something that would be useful or almost useful, to quote the name of the show. So anyway, that's one way of thinking about the quilts of Gee's Bend. But another way of thinking about it is as a kind of futurological practice, which hadn't occurred to me before. But if you're in a situation where you and everyone else are stricken by poverty, very much as a result of racism, and you have very little in terms of resources available to you, and people are working themselves to an early death in the fields and wearing these clothes through with sweat and dirt and wear, then what could be more powerfully futurological as a statement of resistance and endurance than to take exactly those material traces and transmute them into something that's not only useful but also radiantly, aesthetically beautiful, right? And so, in a funny way, although this has nothing explicitly futurological about it, as I said, if you think about craft as a mode of adaptation and creativity, instead of thinking of it as a method of reinscribing tradition, maybe this is a much more persuasive emblem of what futurology could look like than anything that I've showed you in the first half of the talk, right? And if we sort of bring that idea forward, we can think about ways that people are reacting to the landscape of consumption and overproduction around us in adaptive ways, like this artist Alireza Rostami turning leftover computer parts into a functioning camera that works in the same way as a 19th century dry plate camera did. Or a great example, Eric van Hove, who's a Belgian designer who went to North Africa and worked with artisans there to create motorbikes using traditional crafts like bone carving, copper work, as a way of replacing the crap malfunctioning scooters and motorcycles that were being exported en masse from Europe after they'd been used up. So this is very much like Gee's Bend, right? These commodities are now valueless for their original purpose. And Van Hove's idea was to work as a designer with these communities in order to make these objects that not only functioned well, but also were beautiful, desirable local status objects, right? So there's something of a kind of common ethos here between the kind of recycling or upcycling logic of the Gee's Bend quilt and this example. Or to pivot radically, we could think about the tradition of feminist art and its adherence to the idea of crafts as a means of political activism. So GD Chicago would be, again, the kind of inevitable example here. You kind of all know the dinner party, I'm sure, in the Brooklyn Museum. So this retelling of female history as a three-sided table of imaginary exchange between these great women of the past. You might not know her birth project, which is much more like a Gee's Bend quilting circle, I guess, writ large, where she created these very powerful images of birth, as she pointed out, an iconography that would be very, very commonplace in art history if men were the one having the babies. As she put it, if men got pregnant, there would be 1 million images of the crowning, right? So what she did to realize these images was to create this dispersed, very whole earth catalog, like participatory system in which she would send her designs out to these amateur quilters and embroiderers and macrame makers, and they would make the work for her. And you probably haven't even heard of the Birth Project. It's very not well known at all, certainly compared to the dinner party, but it's probably the single largest contemporary artwork ever completed. She made hundreds and hundreds of these images, and in some cases, as in this one, in the case of this object, the crafter involved spent up to a year or as much as 2 years making a single work, right? Because they're making an 18-foot wide embroidery, because Judy Chicago said, I'd like you to do that, right? So obviously not displacing the seemingly quite patriarchal triangular model of the artist being in charge of the artisanal workshop. But then again, that's what most contemporary artists do, right? And she's just using exactly that same methodology to create this hopefully empowering set of images around birth. And then she actually never showed them together either. She showed them in an equally dispersed way all across the country. Now, as you may know, Judy Chicago has a show up at the New Museum right now where she poses this very futurological question: what if women ruled the world? And I don't know if you can read that, but the banners say things like, would both men and women be strong? Would there be equal parenting? Would old women be revered? And the one that I thought you'd be most interested in, would buildings resemble wombs? And in fact, she made a building that kind of resembles a womb. It's also sort of based on the Venus of Willendorf. And that was the structure in which those banners were originally presented, weirdly as part of a Dior catwalk show. So that just shows you where we are in the 21st century. But there's the building. And I thought, you know, as a representation of what feminist architecture could look like, this is so on the nose that I almost had to show it to you, just so you could think about that. And again, think about this as a kind of futurological structure. Weirdly, it has all of the same combinations of handcraftedness and abstraction as the science fiction images and the bull cenotaph that I showed you earlier. In fact, it looks a lot like the bull cenotaph when you're standing in front of it, right? But in this gender flipped way. So that's Judy Chicago. This is something I put in the last minute for Sasson. This is a designer called Marlene Housseau, who's Belgian again, and her idea was to make designs that are not intended as where their principal audience is not human, but rather their principal audience is the insects that might live in them. So she started out by making these objects using resin. She comes from a family of beekeepers, and she started off by making these objects and using resin that's made as a kind of byproduct of hive construction. And then she moved into making actual habitats for these insects. And last night at dinner, Sasson was talking about interspecies gentrification. So basically the idea here would be that we continue to occupy animal habitats, whether it's deer or bear or wolves or bats, and they don't get to return the favor, right? And so what if we were to create a kind of backstream gentrification into our own spaces by rethinking architecture and design as optimized for these non-human agents, right? So a kind of interspecies subjectivity. So that's Marlene Housseau. This is another example of these. And here she's this is again another almost useful story. So these are kind of chairs that you guys, I guess, could sort of sit on. But again, they're meant to be optimized for the insects that might take up residence in them. So anyway, Sasson, that's for you. And then let me just conclude by giving two examples of a different kind of architectural reclamation project, which again, it seems strangely relevant in a very unexpected way to the story about craft in the future. So first, Simone Lee, whose work Brick House is arguably the most, I want to use the word iconic, most potent recent artwork to come out of the American scene over the past 2 or 3 years, very well celebrated. Used to be on the High Line, then was sort of the centerpiece object for the Venice Biennale. And, you know, there's a lot that could be said about it, but one thing that should be said about it is that it's not only a piece of sculpture, but it's also a piece of architecture, or at any rate, responds very much to the idea of architecture. So the overall form alludes to West African architectural structures. It's called Brick House, which is sort of an allusion to a playground taunt on one level, but it also has to do with this idea of impregnability and self-defendedness, which relates to a lot of reading and thinking that Simone Lee was doing about the history of black female philosophy and the question of resilience and a kind of interior building of strength. So here thinking about people like bell hooks maybe. influential in her thinking, and that also explains why the eyes are erased on the face. So it's this refusal to meet your gaze and a kind of defendedness against even the act of trying to seize upon the figure through an act of looking. Some of you may know the other great feminist artwork by Barbara Kruger. That's a picture of a woman, and it says, "Your gaze hits the side of my face," right? And this is like a shielded response to that kind of idea of phallocentrism and ocular pleasure in the subjectified female form. So this is a refusal of all that, and a very architectural refusal, right? It's like a fortress. So there it is in the Arsenale. And then, of course, Lee also was given the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale over in the Giardini. I don't know if any of you actually saw this, but this is what it normally looks like, i.e. it looks a lot like that very first slide that I showed to you, the Renaissance ideal city, right? So that classical language that's so often been used as a gesture towards a better, more enlightened future. I don't have to tell you that it also looks like a certain building here on campus. And she turned it into this, right? So she totally destabilized it and brought it not specifically to Ghana, but performed that same kind of geographical displacement, that same kind of operation that in a funny way Doxianis and Fuller were trying to enact when they went to Ghana. But of course, instead of imposing Eurocentrism and modern values and solutions onto that distant landscape, she did exactly the reverse and brought this African iconography, powerful African iconography to this pavilion. Now, the next artist this year who will be operating in that same theater, who's been given the pavilion, is Jeffrey Gibson. First time a Native American artist has been given that opportunity or that platform. And I've referred to Native American culture a couple of times in this lecture without, well, first of all, without actually acknowledging that we're on unceded Native American land, which is a good practice that we should all bear in mind. But also without really talking about Native American agency, right? So it's, again, always viewed from the outside, whether it's by Ansel Adams or George O'Keeffe or Oracle Magazine. Well, here's Jeffrey Gibson, who's from mixed tribal background, including Cherokee, and he's created this amazing body of work that precisely involves this conflation of abstraction and the crafted. So here are works that he's made on deer skins. These are the works that really made his reputation initially, these boxing punching bags that are made with the same materials and techniques that would be used to make powwow regalia, so these jingles and beadwork. Also these painting-like objects that combine actual painting with more beadwork that often quote from disco songs and other things that Jeffrey's just into, but often have this very liberatory quality. Here's the last show that he had at Sycamore Jenkins Gallery. As you can see, it says, "The land is speaking, are you listening?" right on the wall, which is almost like something Ebenezer Howard could have said in the Garden City movement, weirdly. So it's, again, this assertion of the importance of the local. You know, if you see this show in Chelsea, what do you think? Do you think about the Native Americans who used to live on Manhattan, as it was called, Manhattan Island? Do you not? Are you listening? And so he's going to have the opportunity to take on the U.S. Pavilion and become the representative of American culture abroad, in the same way that Fuller was in Ghana, let's say. And what is that going to look like? I don't know, but I'm going to close with this work, which is also how I closed my book, Crafting American History, which is a work that Gibson made in tribute to James Baldwin. So that's the JB that you see at the bottom of the inscription. And what it says is a paraphrase, almost a direct quote from James Baldwin. It says, "American history is longer, larger, more beautiful, and more terrible than anything anyone has ever said about it." And I would say that goes equally for the future. Thanks.